Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, and I'm your host, Steve. If you like listening to The History of the Papacy, you can watch it too on YouTube. So go to YouTube and search for The History of the Papacy or follow the link in the show notes. And while you're there, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell to get updates when new episodes are published. We also have exclusive content there, The History of the Papacy in 10 minutes. They're like mini sidetrack episodes in a documentary form. I think you'll love them, so at least I hope. Now, let's talk a little bit about Patreon, because we're back on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. And there are 4 tiers: the Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome tiers. And those are to match the 4 early patriarchates of early Christianity. Each tier has its own rewards. There's book drawings. There's audio of the YouTube video exclusive History of the Papacy in 10 minutes. There'll be bonus content. But most importantly, you'll be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. And you will know that in traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops who are commemorated. And they're commemorated in order, so the earlier you join, the higher you're up on the diptychs. So I want to thank the latest person to join the History of the Papacy diptychs, who joined at the Constantinople level. I want to thank Lana. You are magnificent, Lana, and thank you so much for your support. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Now, as you well know, if you've been a listener of this show, around this time of the year, spring, if you're living in the northern hemisphere, fall for our southern friends, I usually take a break from publishing new content. But not this year. You're in luck. I have a brand new series on the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament. And we're featuring in this episode the great Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast. In this series, we discuss the history, background, and literary value of each of the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament. Jonah might be the one who you're most familiar with, but you will soon be familiar with many, many more, at least 11 of them to be precise. We will also wrap up the series with a Q&A about these prophets and evaluate them based on a series of highly subjective categories we came up with. We may also do this as a special live stream event, so let me know if that's something you might be interested in. I want to thank Garry so much for doing this series. He really did the bulk of the work as far as research, and it was really, he did a great amount of work making these episodes really flow well. So I want to thank him very much. I want to thank you for listening. I really hope that you enjoy this break in the History of the Papacy. Not a full break for me, but I hope that you enjoy this little series that's going to cleanse your palate a bit before we get into our next really big series, which is going to be really great. So with that, here is another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. All right, welcome back to another exciting collaboration between the History of the Bible and History of the Papacy podcast. This is the beginning of a series on the 12 Old Testament prophets, labeled the 12 minor prophets in some circles,
Don't let them fool you, though. Even though their books are a bit shorter than some of the other prophets, these 12 are not minor leaguers. They have messages and ideas that show that they are ready for the big leagues, just not the length of their texts. This is our first series, Gary, in quite a while. We've done some one-off episodes, but I think since our wonderful, which people should definitely go back and listen to again and again and again, our series on the apocalypse, I think that this one's going to give it a run for its money.
And it's a topic which isn't often covered. The 12 minor prophets. You don't find too many series about them. I mean, how many people know who Zephaniah is?
And they ought
I don't, and I'm studying him.
Yeah, they really ought to know who he is.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back. This is our introductory episode to the 12 minor prophets, so we'll keep this one short, but we want to really talk about what is a prophet in the Old Testament sense.
I think the word prophet is incredibly misleading, and I wish we had a better English word for it. I mean, in English, a prophet indicates a soothsayer, someone who predicts the future. All the people labelled prophets in the Old Testament, they hardly ever predict the future. I mean, you can only find substantial prophecies in the book of Daniel, really. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and the minor prophets, they're not into predicting the future. In Mesopotamia, prophets were all over the place. And since we don't have a substitute for the word prophet, I'll keep using the word prophet. They're more like priests, I suppose. They were viewed as a conduit to the gods. And they were often really just little local government functionaries. And they would often go to the local chieftain or the mayor of the town and say, "Oh, the god Marduk has told me he wants an extra room on his temple." And the chieftain would go, "Really?" "Absolutely. Marduk needs an extra room on the temple." So they built an extra room on the temple. Now, the Hebrews had such prophets as well. And if you run through the Old Testament, you'll find many, many references to the court prophets. People employed by the king to give religious guidance, maybe keep track of what God is thinking. And they're all over the place. But they are pretty much yes men. They are people who the establishment employs to tell the king, "Everything is fine, Your Majesty," or "Maybe the people are getting a bit grumpy in this town over here and we ought to do something about it." The prophets that most people think about from the Old Testament are the biggies: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the 12. Now, in Hebrew, the word prophet is navi, which means one who is called or one who announces. Again, there's no sense of being a soothsayer or a fortune teller here. And throughout the entire monarchy, from David through to the end of the Two Kingdoms period, you find these prophets pop up in Hebrew history to give the current king a great whacking over the head, to tell him to do the right thing by God, and often to do the right thing by his people.
So before we get too far into these prophets, let's talk quickly. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, and you have a whole entire podcast about it. How was the canon of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible? It goes by several different names, but what people would commonly understand as the Old Testament. How was that organized?
The Hebrew Bible is organized quite differently to the Christian Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is divided into three portions: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The Torah are the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Nevi'im, which simply means prophets, consists of books we don't consider as prophets. For example, in the Hebrew Bible, after Deuteronomy comes, Joshua, Judges, 2 books of Samuel, 2 books of Kings, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are in the middle section of the Hebrew Bible, called the prophets. In a Christian Bible, they're regarded as histories, and they're put into a section along with, say, the books of Chronicles, whereas the Hebrew Bible treats Chronicles at the very end. So the middle section, Nevi'im, the prophets, runs from Joshua through to Ezekiel and the 12 minor prophets. And the last section of the Hebrew Bible, the third part, is the Ketuvim, which simply means writings. It's everything else. From Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. It's everything which isn't in the first two sections. As far as we know, that section has been around, that division has been around forever. Well, not forever. It's been around since at least, say, the time of the early Roman Empire. It's believed that the Torah was the first section to have codified or consolidated. Then came the middle section, the prophets, and the final section, the writings, came together by a process we do not know, where a whole bunch of ragbag books got cemented in the Bible for whatever reason. So that's the Hebrew division of the Old Testament, or Tanakh as it's called.
And then so the Christians, some Christians go by the Jewish reckoning, like the Protestants for the most part, and the Catholics to some degree, but then the Orthodox or the Copts, etc., they use the Septuagint's reckoning.
If we're talking about the ordering of the 12 minor prophets.
And with the Old Testament in general, are they all pretty much on the same page?
I think all Christians are pretty much on the same page. For example, all Christians have the two books of Chronicles after the two books of Kings, because they're histories, whereas the Jews put Chronicles as the very last books of the Old Testament, because they were deeply unimpressed by Chronicles. They thought that the books of Chronicles were pretty much redundant. Who cares about them?
That's what's interesting to me about the Old Testament, is that these Israelites that they really seemed obsessed with organizing and processing these foundational documents. Yeah. And I wonder if that's because of that's the only evidence we have from the ancient world, or was that something that was going on in the ancient world, that people were really organizing their foundational documents like that, and these like national myths and origin stories?
I don't know.
I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Just off the top of my head, the only people of comparable antiquity that have such a sizable body of literature would be the Egyptians, wouldn't it? Or at least a sizable body of literature that has come down to us.
I mean, I guess like if you go to India and places like that, they have these documents, yeah. But it just seems that these Israelites and early Jews were really focused on editing and organizing and reorganizing and anthologizing these documents.
They must have had a moderately large, for the times, I suppose, scribal caste. And the religious and social impetus to construct these documents, I suppose, we have lots of bits and pieces from Babylon and Assyria and that sort of stuff. But how much of their writings was used to construct social identity, to document their religion?
So then these prophets, you say they respond to crisis, and that's really, yeah. Like you said, they're not so much they're not people who predict the future. They don't say, well, next year this X, Y, and Z is going to happen. They're really kind of people who talk to God and then say it the way it is.
Yeah. In general, you'll find that the prophets, they're responding to some sort of social or political crisis in their region of operation. Now, excluding Samuel, who's associated with David, all the prophets are part of the two kingdoms period. So it's the kingdom of Israel to the north and Judah to the south. The very earliest prophets we know of, Elijah, Elisha, Amos and Hosea, are part of the northern kingdom. Now, we won't be doing Elijah and Elisha in this series because they need their own episodes by themselves because they're such biggies. But people like Amos and Hosea in the northern kingdom of Israel were responding to a particular dynasty of kings called the Omrids, who were one of the longer-lived dynasties of Israel, because Israel churned over kingly dynasties fairly quickly. Amos and Hosea seem to be responding to social crises in the Omrid era, where the Omrids are depicted as evil and wicked tyrants, and the people are depicted as downtrodden by this kingly dynasty. And in the background behind this social critique of Amos and Hosea, there is also the lingering threat of Assyria, the great superpower, which decade by decade edges closer to Israel.
Yeah, it seems like each one of these 12 prophets, they're really trying to like hammer home one point. They're not making a lot of big points. Like each one has one main idea that they're trying to push.
That's true. It seems to be one idea. For example, after Amos and Hosea, and the northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria, all the prophets are now from Judah, because Judah's the only kingdom left. And prophets like Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah are all warning of the menace of Babylon, which is another superpower growing in the east and which threatens Judah. After Judah itself is destroyed by Babylon, then you find another group of prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, maybe Malachi, who are responding and writing from Babylon and the exile.
Now, we have these minor prophets. We probably should define who the major prophets are, just really quickly.
In the Hebrew tradition, there are three major prophets: Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. Christians add Daniel. In the Hebrew tradition, Daniel is not a prophet and is considered a slightly lunatic man or person, and he's stuck in the section called the Writings. But Daniel joins the big four.
And we have covered Daniel in a series.
Yep.
I think he gets 2 episodes, if I'm not mistaken. And he deserves to.
He deserves to.
Yeah, he was a good old time, Daniel. But so now we've talked about what a prophet is, and we're going to focus in on these 12 minor prophets. The Jewish tradition is a little different. There's kind of a breakdown between, I guess you really couldn't even say it's the Jewish tradition per se. It's the Catholic, Hebrew, and Protestant puts them in a certain order. And then the Septuagint, which the Orthodox Christians, Copts, Eastern Orthodox, etc., they use a slightly different ordering. Maybe we can talk about that just for a minute.
Yeah. Now, one thing, these prophets called the 12, in the Hebrew tradition, are sort of considered one book and sort of not. If you go to a Jewish Bible, you'll find that they're in a book called the 12, but with sort of chapter divisions, one for each prophet. The reason why they're considered one book is probably because they were all at one time written on a single scroll. Because if you add up the contents of all the 12 minor prophets together, their total wordage is about the same as one of the biggies, like Isaiah or Jeremiah. So at one point, or maybe quite often, they're written on one single scroll, because some of these prophets are really, really short, a single chapter. And had perhaps, say, Obadiah, which is the shortest book in the Bible, been preserved on just its little itsy-bitsy scroll, that scroll may have been lost. So as far as we know, traditionally, they were kept on a single scroll, sort of regarded as a book and sort of not. Even though they're on a single scroll and grouped as the 12, nonetheless, they're divided into chapters. So Hosea, in one ranking, Hosea is a chapter, Joel is a chapter, Amos is a chapter, and so on. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, made supposedly around about the year 300 in Egypt under Ptolemy II, has, for whatever reason, a slightly different order to the Catholic, Protestant, and Hebrew order. Both of them start with Hosea, but then they swap around Joel, Amos, and Micah. It doesn't really... we have no idea why that is. And it doesn't really matter that much. How many people would know that Habakkuk comes before Zephaniah anyway? Really. Or where these people were located in history. And we have no idea why it happened. Oh, by the way, actually, I just found the very oldest manuscript fragment that we have of the 12 prophets is from the Septuagint, and it is the oldest manuscript of the Septuagint that we have, and it dates from the 2nd century AD. So that's the very oldest portion of the Septuagint that we have, and it is the oldest manuscript of the 12 in either Greek or Hebrew.
So that's really interesting. The dating of these, the Hebrew version is pretty much trying to put them into a chronological order, and they're going back to the 800s, or they're dating these as the 800s and the 900s BCE, and that's really old. Do most scholars think that these books were written that long ago?
I think yes, actually. If you look at the two oldest, Hosea and Amos, I think that most scholars would agree, yeah, they really were written in the time they claim to have been written, in 8th century Israel.
Just to give us a benchmark of age there, how do they compare to maybe a book like Genesis and when Genesis was proposed to be written?
Most of the books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, probably were not completed until the Persian period, which is around about the year 500. So they would have been finished later than these little books of the minor prophets were written. Although there are deep strands in all Genesis to Deuteronomy, which go back probably to about, say, the time of Hosea and Amos in the 8th century. I think most scholars would say that. The time of Hosea and Amos is probably when a group of people called the Yahweh supporters, the Yahwists, people who believed in a single God, who had certain characteristics, first came into being in northern Israel. And this school of people probably also started the traditions behind Genesis and so on. But the final versions of those books are pretty... Most scholars would say, no, Persia, at the latest.
So people were starting to jot down these stories at about that time?
Yeah, at the time that Hosea and Amos, two of the first three prophets, minor prophets, were doing their thing, people starting to write down the very earliest stories of the Hebrews.
Well, I think we have a very good basis to start off this series. It's going to be a wild ride going through these 12 prophets because there's a lot going on with each one, and some of their stories are kind of boring, some of them are kooky, some of them are they all are definitely interesting.
They certainly are.
So we will catch you the next time when we will start talking about the first of the 12.
Toodles.